Well, I guess I just wanted to introduce Dr. Michael Harding, and this is the Pathology Anthology. We had plans of coming up with poems for Mike for all of the different diseases, but we didn't do that. So we're going to save that for next time. But Mike's going to give us a general overview of some of the different pest issues, and take it away, Mike. Thanks for coming.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Okay, hi everybody. First of all, did anyone bring anything or have anything on their mind with respect to crop disease issues? We'll cover that right off the top. Okay, stripe rust. Stripe rust in cereals. Stripe rust is a disease in cereals that we don't see necessarily at troublesome levels every single year. And why is that? Well, it doesn't overwinter very often in Alberta. And so as a result, we see it when it blows in. And it usually blows in from the Pacific Northwest. And that's what's happening this year. So we are definitely getting stripe rust coming in from the Pacific Northwest in 2020, and we're seeing it in our cereal crops. We're seeing it in some cereal crops that we don't normally expect to see it in as well, like durum. We've had lots of durum fields positive for stripe rust, and that's a little unusual. We often see winter wheat get severely affected, especially if it overwinters in the winter wheat. It'll become very severe by the end of the season. But this is one of the years that it's been blowing around, and it was reported for the first time right around Lethbridge about a month ago. I just found it for the first time in Brooks at our research plots there this week. So it's been kind of marching northward a bit as well. Probably come in late enough for most of the province that we're not probably going to have to intervene with fungicides. But there are some fields in southern Alberta that if they were susceptible and they didn't get a fungicide, there might be some issues. So one of the other interesting things I heard today for the first time was that we're seeing it in barley. And that's usually a different species of rust that causes the stripe rust in barley, or a different Forma specialis for you plant pathology nerds. So that's interesting. You won't have a hard time finding stripe rust around any of these plots now, because it was reported in Lethbridge a month ago, and it's had lots of time to get going, and the cool, wet weather really helped it to get going. So any specific questions about stripe rust? Yeah, so the question or statement is, fungicides after anthesis, are they valuable for management of stripe rust? So if you put a fungicide on after the crop has finished flowering, you can protect some green tissue, but it's not going to prevent yield loss at that point. The yield loss has kind of already been determined, and you're not going to get a return on investment. And what I mean is, it's not necessarily that the day that the last anther drops off, the window closes, but the window is slamming shut at that point. And so your ability to generate a return on investment from a fungicide really drops off to zero in the week or weeks after anthesis. So many of our crops are past that point. And so if you start to see stripe rust, it'd be a revenge spray. It wouldn't put money in your pocket. Most of our varieties that have moderate resistance or resistance will do a good job of preventing any yield loss. And in those moderately resistant varieties, you might see a stripe or two on a plant here and there, but it probably won't reach economic levels. If it's got really strong resistance, you might see some stripes, but they never get orange pustules in them. Instead, they get little black spots in them. And that's actually a different phase of the life cycle. It's producing telia that will overwinter. Not really. So the question is there a lab test for rust? stripe rust is pretty recognizable based on symptoms if you catch it when it's sporulating. When those pustules break open and you see those orange spores in a stripe along the leaf, that's stripe rust for sure. So we don't really do lab testing for stripe rust. We usually just go based on symptoms. We recognize it based on the symptoms. But if you're looking at a stripe rust lesion after a big rain that's washed all the spores off, or late in the season after it's finished sporulating, sometimes it'll look like cereal leaf beetle damage or even bacterial leaf stripe. So later in the season, if there's no orange pustules left, it can be a little harder to diagnose. But again, usually by that time, you're past the point of being able to do anything about it, so it's not that important. So question about cultural means for managing stripe rust. When it overwinters, breaking the green bridge is critical. And so what I mean by that is, if you have stripe rust here and you plant winter wheat right there, and they're still green at the same time, then it's going to go into the winter wheat, it's going to overwinter, and then you'll have the disease showing up in May. And it can be really damaging when that happens. So waiting to plant winter wheat until a week or two after your spring cereals have been harvested breaks the green bridge. It won't survive. It doesn't survive in the soil. It can't grow without a green host. So if you kill the green host, wait 2 weeks, and then plant the next one, then you break that green bridge, and that's one way to manage it. Now, it doesn't always survive over winter because we get some cold winters. But if you have a lot of snow cover that's insulating, or if you have a mild winter, then it can, and it can show up a lot earlier and be a lot more troublesome. Boy, great questions. Anything else about stripe rust? Yes. Oh, something else. Go for it. Powdery mildew can flare up and disappear real quick. And so it's tough to predict the risk of powdery mildew. The same sort of rule applies that, if you're 5 to 10 days after anthesis and the powdery mildew is flaring up, you're probably really too late to protect yield. So, but you're seeing a big powdery mildew flare and you're just coming into flagleaf emergence, boy, you'd really want to consider a fungicide to protect that upper canopy.
And just to follow up on the powdery mildew, because I was going to ask about that as well. So there was some in these plots when we viewed them earlier. Do you think it's probably past that point where we don't have to worry about it? And then as a kind of an aside, my whole back lawn, I just seeded it to sod last year. It's got kind of a similar looking mildew. Are those related species?
Probably not related. Different pathogens are going to cause diseases on turf. Oh yeah, sorry. The question was the plots here that are having powdery mildew in them. Is it too late to spray for those? And I'm seeing some mildew in my lawn. Is that powdery mildew the same thing that's on the wheat? And so the answer is, for the sod, the diseases on turf that are going to cause spots or decline of your lawn, it's not the same powdery mildew that we're seeing in these plots here. And it's probably not powdery mildew, it's probably something else. Is it too late to spray? So how long since flowering? Has it been a week? Yeah, so I'd say you're probably really past the point of protecting much yield now. And you still have lots of photosynthetic tissue. You can sacrifice a lot of those lower leaves to powdery mildew and it won't hurt your yield all that much. As long as your top 3 or 4 leaves are pretty clean, you'll be fine. And powdery mildew usually gets going down low where there's a lot of humidity day and night. If the upper canopy has a lot of air movement and heat, then it pushes the powdery mildew kind of keeps it out of that upper canopy. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
Can powdery mildew in a cereal move to like beans?
Good question. Can powdery mildew that we're seeing in the cereals jump over to the beans? And the answer is no. So the powdery mildew that we're going to see in cereals is a cereal disease. And if we were going to see powdery mildew in beans, it would be a different species. Now, some powdery mildews will cause disease on multiple broadleaf crops. That's more of an issue in greenhouses. So if you're growing greenhouse cucumbers and peppers, there's a couple of 3 different species of powdery mildew that can get in and cause a lot of damage. But in arid southern Alberta, we often don't see a lot of powdery mildew because it stays dry. This year, because it's been wet, and because that lower canopy has such high humidity, we're definitely seeing more of it this year than we do in a normal year. So how much powdery mildew did you see last year, Mike?
Not
0?
I
Yeah.
don't think we've really seen it here for as long as I've been around.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is probably the first year.
So for sure the last 3 dry years, we've seen very little powdery mildew. I've seen it in some winter wheat crops in the last 3 years. But in spring cereals, we haven't seen much. But in a year like this, the conditions are pretty good, cool, wet, and really, especially if there's a dense canopy that's holding a lot of humidity, you'll get powdery mildew happening. And it can be really explosive. Like you'll go in and scout one day and not see much, and then 2 days later, everything's white.
So to kind of follow up, what's the reason that there's different species on, say, the beans? Like, if it's how does it work, or how does it infect the plant that it can't just jump from one to the other?
Yeah, I love that question, because now we're going to go full on pathology nerd here. Okay, so why can't the powdery mildew in wheat just jump over to the beans? Okay, so powdery mildew spores land on the surface of the leaf, and they form a little germ tube that grows, looks like a little filament, and then it goes down into the stomata, the open stomata, or there are some species that'll form a little pressurized bulb called an aprosorium, and it'll force a penetration peg through the epidermis, and then it colonizes like the inside of the sandwich, and it sets up these specialized feeding structures that suck the nutrients out of the plant cells. So the plants are busy photosynthesizing and creating sugar, and the fungus is eating it. And in order to set up those infection structures, that's a very complicated, intimate mutualism that you have to have the right molecules to do that. Because if you don't have the right molecules, the plant is going to say, oh no you don't, and it's going to shut down the infection. So the species of fungus that's adapted to get into the wheat doesn't have the molecular tools to get into the beans. And in order for a fungus to have the molecular tools to get into multiple crops, it has to have an enormous genome and be ready to express all these different plants, and that comes at a huge fitness cost. So a lot of these pathogens like powdery mildew and stripe rust that are biotrophic, meaning they only survive on a green host, they're very specifically adapted to set up a really intimate relationship with that one host. And that's why they don't jump to another one, because the plant says, no, I've got the tools to make this stop. So when we apply a fungicide to prevent infection, we have to get that fungicide on before the fungus is setting up those specialized feeding structures. So we can prevent infection at spore deposition, spore germination, and even spore penetration. But once it starts colonizing inside the plant tissue, we don't really have fungicides that are systemic to the point that they can cure that infection. So timing is critical.
We don't see stripe rust until it's pretty infected plant.
Yeah.
So
So
then what's the value of the fungicide?
the value of the fungicide is you protect the areas of the leaf that have not been infected. Oh, I didn't repeat that question. For stripe rust, what's the value of applying a fungicide if we have to kind of take that wait and see approach? We don't know if stripe rust is going to show up. So do we just spray fungicides all the time? Well, no, we scout the crop, and when we start seeing more than one plant in a square meter infected, especially if it's a susceptible or moderately resistant, then we start getting a fungicide protecting the upper canopy so that it doesn't get worse. So for stripe rust and powdery mildew, if you take a wait and see approach too far, they're explosive enough that it's too late and you just lost a whole bunch of yield. Yeah. Now with cereal leaf diseases like tan spot and septoria, they can really get brewing in the lower canopy, like to really high levels at the bottom of the plant. But if they're not showing up on any flag leaves, I may not spray. So with that disease, you can take more of a wait and see approach, and it's, it's climbing, it's halfway up, and now it's 2/3 of the way up. Okay, now I'm worried I better maybe protect the upper canopy with a fungicide before it gets any higher. Whereas with stripe rust, in a susceptible variety, if you see a stripe, you better really consider a fungicide unless you're a week past anthesis. Okay, awesome. That was great. Thanks for those questions. Any more? Yes?
So if COVID-19 is public enemy number one, what's public enemy number one for crops of southern Alberta, say south of Highway 1? If we're going to go into a field and scout only one disease, which one would that be?
Okay, wow, that's a great question. And I did not put you up to this because I was going to take lessons learned from COVID to be tactical about plant disease management. So, wow, the question was, if COVID-19 is the number one human disease issue of 2020 that we're all watching out for and being careful of, what's the number one plant disease or crop disease in 2020? In cereal crops, in southern Alberta, it's a stripe rust year, for sure. I mean, I did a little bit of a scouting tour last week and saw it in just about every field I visited from Calgary south and from, the whole width of the province. So it's definitely a year that we're going to see a lot of stripe rust. I would be really cautious about the Green Bridge because if we get a mild winter or a lot of snow, we could set ourselves up for a real bad stripe rust problem come spring 2021. So I know that seeding winter wheat early is advantageous in some ways, but be careful because if you get stripe rust in your winter wheat and it overwinters, you got a real difficult challenge ahead of you in 2021.
Mike,
Yes.
what about a crop like fall rye? We're seeing more and more of that being grown. You guys saw it from the grain.
Yep.
Is it susceptible to stripe rust in, say, the fields?
So fall rye, is that also going to be a green bridge and create issues for stripe rust the same as wheat? Most of our fall rye and triticale is usually a little more resistant or tolerant. We don't normally see a lot of stripe rust in those crops, but we fear that we're in the middle of a race shift for stripe rust. So if I promised you that it wouldn't be a problem, they might make a liar out of me, if there's a race shift going on. So I'm not sure. If the crop is being taken off for silage, there's probably not going to be a challenge for the green bridge. So that's fine. But for crops that are fall seeded and are going to survive the winter, if they get stripe rust on them and it overwinters, it creates a whole new set of challenges for stripe rust management. Canola, I would say in canola the usual suspects, and in a year like this, the last time we had this much moisture or a similar amount of moisture was 2016, and in that year we lost over $1 billion of canola yield to sclerotinia. So I'm anticipating sclerotinia to be a force to be reckoned with in our sclerotinia susceptible crops, especially if we continue in this cycle of getting a thunder shower every 3 to 7 days. Pulses, Aphanomyces, We've tested dozens of samples for Aphanomyces so far this year, and a lot of folks are really concerned about how that's affecting pea and lentil production. And this is going to be a good year for that pathogen because wet soils help that pathogen infect. And I sure hope we stay clubroot free in the south. I hope, fingers crossed, knock on wood, yeah. But in a wet year, if there's a lot of mud traveling around on vehicles, it's a concern. So what about corn? I don't scout nearly as many cornfields as I'd like to. So there's probably other people that can tell you more about what's brewing in the corn crops. But what I can tell you is that in years where we get a lot of rain or wind-driven hail, wind-driven rain or light hail, we get a lot of Gossa's wilt. And so I don't know if there's, like I said, I haven't been in enough cornfields yet this year to know if that's an issue. Anytime. Yeah, so it can be seed borne, and it can start to show up in the seedling stage. And if it goes systemic, the plants will die. Yeah, usually we just get the leaf blight, but if we get the wilt phase, it's catastrophic. So usually it's just in areas that have had hail or a lot of wind-driven rain, we'll see bacterial diseases. And so on that note, in a lot of cereal fields that I've scouted this year, I've seen bacterial leaf streak or halo blight. So in oat crops, I've seen a lot of halo blight, and in wheat, I've seen a lot of bacterial leaf streak. And again, it's because those diseases usually follow storms. And if there's a lot of rain and mist and humidity, it'll pick bacterial cells up and they'll move with the storm, and we'll just see it in a lot of fields. So in cereal crops, just because you see a spot or a stripe, don't assume that a fungicide is going to take care of it, because it might be a bacterial disease. Now, we've tested a lot of samples for viral diseases, wheat streak mosaic, and a few viral diseases in other crops. And with one exception, they've all been negative, so it doesn't appear to be that. I'm hearing from some entomologists that they're starting to see a lot of, is this bacterial leaf streak?
Well, that's our wheat plots, so you tell me.
So this could be wheat streak mosaic.
Well, that's what I was hoping it wasn't.
It could be, but wheat streak mosaic, you can't tell based on symptoms. You have to test. So this is something that could be tested. Do you want me to test it?
Oh, that'd be great.
Okay.
Is wheat streak, doesn't it typically just about decimate the entire crop though?
It depends.
Pretty good looking heads and stuff the last couple of years, but that's just showed up now.
Yeah, it depends on the vector. So the wheat curl mite is going to determine when it shows up and how bad it gets. So if it's only just recently showed up, it's probably not going to cause a lot of yield loss because you're past that point. Because that's when the vector shows up.
But for that vector, you need wind as well, right?
Yep. Or migration. Yeah. And this year I suspect the only way that it's getting here is migration because it's shown up so late. We haven't seen it in any of the fields we've tested. Yeah. So is that enough as far as some of the major diseases for 2020? Any other questions? Okay, so I thought I'd just take a little bit of time. Hopefully you're not so sick of hearing about COVID-19 that you won't bear with me on this, but what can we learn from COVID-19 to help us be more tactical in our plant or crop disease management? Okay, so with COVID-19, the health experts are telling us, wait and see if you die, and then if you do, we'll protect your family, right? No, they're not saying that. What are they saying? What are the healthcare professionals saying? Stay out of the old folks' homes. What else?
Stay 6 feet apart.
Stay 6 feet apart and masks. Wash your hands. Okay, these are all preventative. They're not saying wait and see if you get it and then we'll save your family. They're saying prevent. That's the best way. Now, when we're talking about a death in the family, that's not something to joke about. So I'm not trying to make light of that. And so there are some critical differences between crop disease management and the safety of your family. But I'm trying to draw the conclusion, the lesson here, that when you hear a plant pathologist get up and say, please rotate, please sanitize your equipment, please prevent diseases, it's because it's the best way to manage them, okay? So if you can avoid, it's going to make every other practice you do that much better. So if I ignore the hand washing and I wear a mask, am I going to win against COVID? Probably not. If I wash my hands, but I don't physical distance from my sister who just came from New York, am I going to win? Probably not, right? So we have to integrate the tools in a tactical way. Okay, so for COVID, it's avoid, right? Wash your hands, wear a mask, social distance. I think we covered most of them. And then monitor. We call it crop disease, we call that scouting, right? So monitor your symptoms. What are the symptoms of COVID? Runny nose, cough, a new cough, headache, fever, right? If you start seeing some of those, especially a couple of days after your sister from New York visits, boy, maybe you need a diagnosis, okay? So then the next thing, before we, you know, you don't go into the doctor and say, I have a cough, and they put you on a ventilator, right? They're gonna wanna come to a diagnosis to know what it is you're dealing with before they try to intervene. So for COVID, they have a PCR approach. That you do a nose and throat swab, and they have a PCR test where they take the RNA virus, they make a DNA copy of it, and then they amplify it. So it's quantitative RT-PCR. And they also have an antibody approach, so that if your body is producing antibodies to the COVID-19 virus, they can just take a blood sample and do an agglutination test or run it on a capillary strip and see if you're producing the antibodies. So then they can get a correct diagnosis, and then if you have COVID, then they're going to treat it as such. Okay, so can we learn anything from that in crop disease management? Yes. If you don't know what the problem is, if you see spots on your leaves and say, I better spray a fungicide, you're not being very tactical. If you see a dead patch in your field and you just assume that it's a drowned out spot, you're not being very tactical. So how can we be, I'm going to tell you now, I have a list here. And if you hang out with plant pathologists, you've heard this 1,000 times. Here are the plant disease management strategies. Number 1, avoidance. So prevent disease by growing when there's no inoculum present or when the environment doesn't favor disease. This would include things like crop rotation, volunteer weed control, tillage, cultural practices, etc. And it may include sanitization for some diseases. The second one is exclusion. This is preventing the introduction of the pathogen. So if it's not naturally here, if it has to be introduced, we can keep it out with clean seed programs, seed treatments, biosafety. The third one's eradication. So we're going to wait and see, and when it shows up, we're going to nuke it. Okay, and that's essentially the way we deal with bacterial ring rot in potato. The third is protection. So that could be intervening with a pesticide of some kind. The fifth is to deploy resistance, so genetically resistant cultivars. And then the third is therapy, so curing diseased plants. Now for field crops, we don't really have therapies to cure diseased plants. We have prophylactic treatments that can protect green tissue, but once it's infected, we can't really cure it. For some plant diseases, though, we do have therapies and cures, but they're usually really valuable small acreage or greenhouse crops. Okay, so I just listed a bunch of strategies. Is that going to help us? Probably not. because there's nothing tactical in what I just told you. So for example, deploying genetic resistance. Well, how are we going to do that for stem rot, Sclerotinia white mold and stem rot? It doesn't exist. Even for Fusarium head blight, we have moderate resistance and in some cases resistance, but it's not really, it's probably not going to get us all the way there. Okay, well then maybe what if we just rely on avoidance? Well, how are you going to do that for Sclerotinia and Fusarium when they're endemic? They're in every field. We can't avoid them. Okay, well, let's use a clean seed program to avoid Sclerotinia. Is that going to help? No, it's not going to help. If I prevent 200 sclerotia bodies from entering a field that's already got 20 million of them, I'm not helping. So we have to take these strategies and become tactical. So I'm going to take you through a couple of examples of how if it was my farm and I was going to up my game with respect to crop disease management, this is how I do it. How much time have I got? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Okay, so I'm going to start with a primary objective. And my primary objective is going to be, I want to maximize the financial return on the farm unit. Okay, that's my primary objective. Because if I don't do that, I'm probably not going to be successful. So that's primary objective. Then under that primary objective, I have a number of secondary objectives that will be things like marketing strategies, borrowing power, programs that will help me get inputs at reduced rates. But one of those things is going to be minimize losses to disease. Okay? So if we focus on that secondary objective of minimizing yield loss to pathogens, now let's go to the third level objective under that and say, I want to minimize pathogen inoculum if I can. I want to avoid introducing the pathogen. I want to prevent the spread. And I want to minimize the impact of the disease on the crop if it shows up. And if I can, I want to shorten the duration of the epidemic. So those may not apply to every single situation, but if I have this plan and I can be tactical, then I can look at what's the biggest problem in my cereals, or the 3 biggest problems in my cereals, and then say, can I minimize the introduction of that problem? And if it's bacterial leaf streak, maybe you can. Maybe it's coming in on seed. I don't know. Can you reduce the inoculum? Are there tactics we could use to reduce the inoculum of Sclerotinia? Crop rotation is one I heard. Anything else? Crop rotation's a pretty big one. We do have a biological that will reduce the number of sclerotia in the soil. So contans, the economics of that is tough to measure. But if you did want to reduce the amount of inoculum in your soil, that's a tactic that you could use. Maybe tillage. Now, every time tillage comes up, I don't dismiss it because it's potentially a tactic, but I wouldn't consider it a foundational management tool for diseases, because it might provide an incremental advantage, but it's not going to solve the problem. And there's study after study that bears this out. Sometimes you see a response, lots of times you don't. So I don't dismiss tillage as a potential disease management tool or tactic, but I wouldn't build a program based on it. What about preventing the spread? So sanitation's a really important one for some diseases that move in infested soil or on seed. Yeah. What about ergot? Can we prevent the spread from the ditches to the fields by mowing? So that's a tactic that we could use for ergot. So I'm not going to go through any more of this, but what I'm trying to say is that if I, on my farm, if I was going to do this, I would sit down and sort of think tactically. I've got all these strategies in a big pile, but how do I know when to use them, and how do I know when they're going to work or not work? The answer to that question is you have to know what the strategies are. So you have to know what's in the toolbox. You have to have an accurate diagnosis of what your problems are. You have to understand a little bit about the life cycle of the pathogen. And you have to understand the disease triangle. And if you know your tools and you have correct diagnosis and you know enough about the life cycle and the disease triangle, now you can get tactical. And you can say, you know what, ergot is ticking me off. What can I do to, reduce the introduction into the field? Well, don't use seed that has ergot bodies in it. Don't introduce it. Mow your fields. Harvest the outside round and bin it separately. So there are tactics you can use to go at that problem. And so setting up a plan and knowing what tools you have and then using them in the right way is important. Question?
Your opinion on the recent removal of Fusarium from Alberta Pest Act?
What did they want? My what?
Opinion.
My opinion. My opinion on the removal of Fusarium head blight from the Pest and Nuisance Control Regulation of the Alberta Pest Act. Maybe not everybody knows this, but I think a month or two ago, the minister announced that Fusarium was coming off the regs. So no longer a regulated pest, Fusarium graminearum, which causes head blight in wheat and stalk rot and ear rot in corn. So I'll answer that question by saying this, by answering these two questions. Did putting Fusarium graminearum on the Pest Act slow down the introduction of Fusarium to Alberta?
Hope so.
Undoubtedly. I've got compelling evidence that I'm happy to show anybody. So when Fusarium graminearum first showed up in Alberta, for those of you that know Ian Evans, he was Johnny on the spot, and he traced back that infestation to Roblin, which is a highly susceptible variety seed that was imported from Manitoba. So it was pretty clear that the first Fusarium graminearum outbreaks in Alberta were coming in on seed. So to stop the introduction of graminearum on seed slowed down the introduction. And I can show you quite a few things to indicate that that's true. Now, is regulation going to stop Fusarium from crossing the border? Is someone going to be there for every Fusarium spore asking for his passport? No. So did we expect that this disease would be stopped in its tracks because it was on the regs? No. But we were hoping to slow it down to give the breeders time to give us some better tools. Now, the same approach was taken for blackleg and canola, and they found great germplasm that's essentially solved the blackleg problem. With Fusarium graminearum and Fusarium head blight, we aren't so lucky. That germplasm really doesn't exist. So they're trying to quantitatively improve resistance a step at a time, and it takes lots of time to do that. Are we at the point? So Fusarium is now pretty common in Alberta. It's present in lots of places that it wasn't present 20 years ago. Is it the right time for it to come off the regs? The minister says yes, and so it is off. But there's lots of people who live in areas where Fusarium is not common that disagree, and that's a tough question to answer because the tipping point isn't going to be the same for everybody depending on where they stand in the province. So lots of people agree. Some people find it contentious. My opinion, I don't think things need to stay on the regs forever. Was it the right time to take Fusarium off? I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe. But it's done. The key point, though, is that regardless of whether it's on the regs or not, it's a management issue. In southern Alberta, it's a management issue. The fact that it's on the regs, how many fieldmen in southern Alberta have issued notices to control fusarium head blight? None, right? So it's not like there's this heavy-handed regulatory approach. It's a management issue. But in places where it's not commonly found and they don't want it introduced, they still would like to have it on the regs. So it's a tough one. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, that's I guess all I can say about it. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to say about tactics. If you have good tactics, you're always going to win, right? Because every sports team that has a good tactical plan wins every game, right? Right? And every fire crew that sets out to stop a forest fire has a tactical plan, and they always are successful, right? No. So important to keep in mind that when we take a tactical approach to plant pathology, we're not always going to win, because we're going to come up against circumstances where we just don't have tools, or our tactics were poor, or whatever, and we're not always going to. Sometimes the fungus wins. So keep in mind that being tactical doesn't mean that you're always going to get your way, but it is going to set you up to not waste money on tools that aren't going to be effective, and it's going to help you maximize your ability to be effective at preventing disease. Okay. That's all I had. Any other questions?
Join me in thanking Mike.